Hello and welcome back to Jagex HQ. Today I'm joined by Mods Timbo and Jack. We're going to be talking about game design, the concept of efficiency, and the dead content problem within RuneScape, or if it is even a problem.
Hello, I'm Mod Timbo, principal game designer and balancer for RuneScape.
I'm Mod Jack. I'm, as of recently, the lead designer on RuneScape.
I think when we're talking about, pleasing the RuneScape player base, it's obviously a very difficult, daunting task, and it's a task that hasn't really been broken down necessarily, where I don't think there's a ton of insight external to, what the actual process is and how you actually, get, say, the XP rates that you potentially land on, or, what considerations you make to prior content when you're making new content. So the first thing I want to touch on was XP rates. So there's obviously, the issue of balancing around players who only care for the best rates imaginable. And then you've also got, level brackets and trying to fit in a game with, varied training methods all the way up. And I wanted to ask sort of what goes into that balancing point.
So it depends what we're balancing for, obviously. So if we are looking at a mid-level update where we've specifically targeted, hey, we release an update that's level 70 to 79, then we will focus on those XP numbers very, very, very heavily. We have spreadsheets there are spreadsheets, my spreadsheets, I guess, we have internally that sort of show XP rates for all different skills, more specifically production skills, production and gathering skills, because they're easier to break down on a spreadsheet than something like in combat. So we have the numbers, we have the different boosts that are available, we have to keep updating those boosts as well, making sure that we get the accurate numbers for those sorts of things and have it all done on paper. So if we're doing an update like that, we'll refer to the spreadsheet, we'll look at these numbers and be like, okay, cool. What is the best XP rate from 70 to 79? For example, if we look at, I don't know, if we look at Profitinus agility, I'd say agility 77 is probably the best XP rate. And then be like, okay, so we want to design it from 70 to 79. What is the XP rate? How much better do you want the XP rate to be? So we'll say like, are there requirements on the update? If there are requirements, like quest requirements or other external requirements that aren't agility related, then we would probably boost the XP rates up. So if there was a huge Grandmaster quest on top as a requirement for that update, we'd likely boost the XP numbers by 10 to 20%, something along those lines. So yeah, there are a bunch of high-level objectives for the update overall. And then the developers go away and they say, well, they want to add to that. So for Het's Oasis, they were like, we want to add a bunch of the beetle stuff, which is the hunting, we want to add a bit of agility, we want to add the drain stuff. And that's all great, and they come back to us, and that's fine. In terms of balancing and what the design vision for that is, we look at a good gap to fill. So like we have tons of data in the game as well, so we know what level everyone is at. We can see break-off points for certain levels as well. So like people stop doing. A common example would be people stop doing prayer at 92. Wow. People don't go above 92.
That's a surprise to me.
There are breakpoints at 95 as well, and very, very rare to see anyone between 96 to 99, 96 to 98, I should say. Sorry. They either stop at 95 and then they're done because they've got the terminal and stuff, or they go to 99 to get the skill cape, and then the next two prayers are 99 as well.
So you have access to all of this data. So you've got all of and your job, I guess, so you're looking for gaps where people are maybe not training across certain points, and then that would be a potential target for an update.
Yeah, so either the high-level design aims or the developer comes back and they say, hey, I want to do an agility update. I don't know where that agility update is, but I know I want it to be a relatively high level, but it's not the best thing in the game. So we're like, okay, cool. So we look at from level 60 to level 90, say, are there any gaps here? Are there any gaps in people playing the game? Like, are there quest requirements that people are struggling to get to? Are there just drop-off points? So people like to stop at every 10 levels. So people stop at 70, 80, 90, just because it's a nice round number.
Yeah, it's rounded out.
Yeah, you get the capes as well if you go always to 70 and 80. So like, can we push them beyond that? Can we push them from 70 to 74? Like, is there a good reason enough to do that? Are there quest requirements and things like that as well? So that factors into sort of like what level we go for when we choose an update like that. Sometimes we do go out explicitly say, like, so when we did the fishing hub, I can't remember what it's called now, the actual real name of the fishing hub. Deep sea fishing.
Yeah, of course.
Deep sea fishing. So when we did deep sea fishing, we explicitly wanted to go for the very top end. So we released Sailfish, released Fishing Frenzy, and that's with the top end in mind. We didn't have a gap to fill.
That's so interesting. I think that's very insightful as well, because I don't think this is something that is discussed frequently or even at all with regard to the actual process. And I think at times as players, sometimes you'll see something and you won't understand just by looking at it the logic behind it. like I don't have access to the data. I
Yeah.
don't see that there's a gap here. It's like, oh, why is this mid-level method coming out? Is something that you see
Exactly.
a lot.
I think a lot of high-level players, they see like, oh, 65, this is garbage. Like, why release an update at 65 when I am not 65? I'm 99. I'm going to 3 million.
This isn't for me, so it's bad.
Not just their 99. Everyone they know is 99.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
All their friends are 99, all their climates are 99. The whole game is like is max level apparently. It's like why do that? But of course they're not. We have a ton of players who are casual players. We have a lot of players who struggle to level certain skills. We have players who just don't like certain methods. So like maybe they do enjoy Hex Oasis. Hex Oasis is very slightly different to other training methods around its level. Not massively because agility is agility, but like it's very slightly different. It's been more interesting. It's a bit different. So we look for those factors as well. But yeah, I mean, players just see dead content. They're like, oh, this is dead content because it's not relevant to me. But there are a lot of factors into why we do certain things.
I think just the level of care that is put into finding these exact kind of level gaps and just the amount of analysis that's actually conducted, I think is really interesting, because you're absolutely right that so often I will hear, oh, this is dead content because it doesn't pertain to me, or this isn't the best XP rate, so it doesn't pertain to me. Follow-up question related to that.
Yeah.
If a reward has a great use outside of a training method, is that factored into the XP? So would you drop the XP on a method? I mean, an extreme example would be Masterwork, of course, or Trim Masterwork, where you get no XP for it. But I think in a less extreme case, let's say the new arrows that just came out after the Extinction Quest, are the XP rates balanced around the fact that they're also very useful and sought after and powerful, or does it not really matter? Is it separate? This is a fletching update, and then it's a PVM thing after that.
They play a factor. Many moons ago at RuneFest, we talked about a 5-year skilling plan, and we discussed there's almost like a trifecta of different factors when it comes to skilling update. So there's terms of experience, there's terms of output, so reward, whether that's not exclusively XP, that's how useful is it to PVM, how much money can I make from it, all that sort of stuff, and AFK ability. And those are a trifecta that have effects on each other. So one thing cannot be super good experience and also be super good FK and also produce a crap load of reward. That's not what we're looking to do anymore these days. So if it's really AFKable, it's probably got decent experience rates, but not
on the top end.
And it probably doesn't give you a very good reward. It probably gives you a reward, which is useful to that skill or to a lower level, but it's not going to be a good reward for the general things. And also, equally, there could be a really good reward that gives a lot of experience, a lot of outside use in PVM or in terms of gold produced, but it probably has low FK and is probably low experience rate at the same time.
Okay.
There's a specific example I can give of that on the Masterwork armor that you mentioned.
Perfect.
But that one, even more so than, like, you're absolutely right to say that, like, we don't want to design things such that they're the best method for every purpose. When it comes to the economy, actually those factors directly contradict each other, because the more accessible something, I mean, like, obviously, right, the more AFKable something is, the less profitable it is, because the more of that thing is being poured into the economy and the prices drop. Likewise, if something is a very good XP rate, people will be doing it. So if it produces something as a side effect, then that thing will not be worth it. It'll probably be at alc value. If it's a good XP rate that produces something, that thing will probably be at alc value, depending on the context, obviously. So with Masterwork armor, that was specifically designed to give, I think it gives like 1
It's
XP,
no
or
XP,
is it 0?
Well, it's 0
I think it
or
gives
1.
1. I think it's something like that.
It
It could give a token amount. It wouldn't really matter. And people look at it and they say, well, this is the hardest, most difficult thing to smith in the game. Why doesn't it give good smithing XP? And the answer is it's specifically intended to not be a training method, because everything about Masterwork armor is intended to make it something that you smith for profit. Now, actually, in practice, that didn't work out that well, because people made it for themselves, because it wasn't intended to be used this way, but people found it really rewarding to actually just do it themselves. So as far as I can see, people tend to make their own Masterwork armor rather than trade it.
It trades decently.
It trades okay, but it's not.
Yeah,
It was intended to be like an exciting market for smiths, and I don't feel like it's really accomplished that. But that's why it doesn't give XP, because
you want it to retain its value.
Yeah, if it was really good XP, people would be making it for XP.
Yeah, there'd be thousands of sets just sitting
and it would have
no value. Related to what you kind of spoke on earlier with regard to, you want to look at the XP rates, how rewarding it is, and then how active it is, how AFK it is. I want to talk about a recent update, which is Croesus, and specifically the Hunter skill. So basically, the meta for Hunter now, from level 40 all the way to 99, is to enter a Croesus instance as a solo and just do the Hunter node and then teleport out and repeat it. And that has completely, from an XP standpoint, that has taken out every other relevant hunter method in the game. It's faster than big game hunter because it scales all the way up with your level. So at the end game XP rates, it's over 1.5 million just base raw XP. So I guess that's a method. It's not super AFK, but it's also not terribly active. It's not as active as big game hunter. It's not rewarding at all, but the XP rates are absolutely nuts to the point of more likely than not kind of eliminating most other methods in the game. So would that be considered like a flawed product as a result of that?
I would definitely say it's not intentional. Not that we're going to nerf it. Please don't worry about that.
Yeah,
I've no plans to nerf it right now. It's definitely an unintentional thing. It reminds me a lot of, you may remember years and years ago, dungeoneering fishing and dungeoneering woodcutting.
Of course.
Again, a very unintentional method where players would dive into C2 and they would fish everything on the floor and woodcut everything and then leave, because that was the most efficient way to do those methods. That wasn't intentional, but again, it does play into some of the factors we talked about, like it's high XP, it's high effort. I think the Croesus thing is probably not as high effort as we would perhaps like, although I guess you could technically fail and zonk out.
It is hard to do.
It is hard to do, but technically you could technically do it. But it gives very little reward in terms of money, in terms of like you don't get the loot from Croesus because you're not going to, never going to.
You get nothing but XP that will allow you to kind of fast track and power level out.
Whereas other hunter methods, there are skill chompers, there are regular chompers, there are turtles, there are other things. They provide you different levels of AFK ability, but also different levels of the reward as well. So I think it's not in an ideal place. I think if the XP rate wasn't as dominating as it was, like I think hunter to 1 to 40 is dominated by.
It's tropical wagtails, I believe, up to a certain point.
It used to be Vinesweeper for a long time, just hunting rabbits. Christ. But yeah, that was an unintentional thing that wasn't meant to be do. I think that it plays into the trifecta thing we're talking about. It's definitely not in the right place, and that it is definitely too strong.
It feels that one's an interesting example because it feels wrong, right?
Yes.
Like if we designed a method with that amount of effort and that amount of rate, it might be a good design. I think the reason it feels wrong on Croesus is because it feels like you're playing the content wrong, or like it feels like you're exploiting the content to get an advantage.
It definitely does. It also feels like the fact that it doesn't change all the way up from 40 to all the way to 99, and it is the best XP method every single level through that, I think is an aspect that feels wrong. It feels kind of cheaty or exploity.
But then, I mean, the example that springs to mind for me there would be Runespan, which similarly sort of effectively replaced an entire skill. And that was also unintentional, and we nerfed it. And then we reverted the nerf because actually there was a lot of outcry over it. And although some people disagree, I think the general feeling is that the skill is in a healthier place.
Okay, so actually to that tune, take me through what happened with Runespan.
The story is fairly straightforward in the sense of like it went out. I think I don't know if it was an error in the balancing or just something unforeseen. That does happen sometimes.
Let's goals and those nodes were like 50% too good, and they didn't disappear as fast as they were intended. So those nodes appeared too often, about 50% too often.
Yeah.
And because they were supposed to be a distraction, effectively, from siphoning from, I can't remember what they're called now.
The S-rates and hounds and
the hounds and those. You're supposed to siphon from them, and occasionally a node would show up, and you'd be like, oh, cool, I can do this node because I'm the right node level, and I'm going to get the cool runes from it. But what ended up happening was that you were just constantly on these nodes all the time, and as we later on found out, players would just hunt for these nodes rather than sit around and wait for them. So it's supposed to be a distraction, but what ended up happening was that was the main method players ended up doing, because that's where the bonus XP was applied, because it was a distraction, wasn't best all the time, so therefore you got more experience as a result. But players were like, no, I'm just going to go to these 3 islands and just hop all the time and make sure I get all the juicy nodes that I can. But yeah, I mean, the Runespan was supposed to be an alternative training method. Runecrafting at the time, or when Runespan release was a nightmare. It wasn't very profitable. It wasn't very interesting. It wasn't very good. We have since then introduced a lot of different methods to runecrafting, to the point where Runespan is no longer the method people do. Even if you're AFKing, you might as well just do normal runes, because you're going to get more XP and more money just running them half as efficiently as someone else.
Yeah, I mean, runecrafting, I think Runespan is still the meta for the early levels, but as soon as you can
super levels,
as soon as you can do Abyss runecrafting, it's good GP, it's good XP, it's definitely
why wouldn't
a
you
lot more
at that
engaged.
point?
Yeah. Runecrafting at this point, I think is, I mean, without getting into rune costs and that stuff, because that's a very, very different.
That's the project I was directly involved with.
Rune costs?
Well, making runes valuable.
Oh, okay.
there's a project myself and Mod Deg worked on in 2013, 2014 called the Rune Value Project, because runes weren't worth anything. A lot of players might know this a long time ago. Runes were worthless. So myself and Mod Deg, that's when we made Rune Viswax, the Viswax machine.
Yeah.
So we made a reason for runes to be consumed, and we created a product that was probably too versatile, but is very, very useful and very valuable, and also limited by supply as well. You can only get X amount a day. That is very intentionally in that way, so that it's a limited supply. So more players have to go engage with it, and then if more players engage with it, that's more runes getting sunk out of the game, and therefore more useful with wax. But also we removed runes from a lot of drop tables. You might remember, like, ironically now fire giants don't drop fire runes anymore.
Yeah.
Like that sort of thing. But we did that at the time. We took a lot of soul runes off as well, even though soul wasn't out. Soul runes became more valuable, and there's been a recent problem for us.
Yeah, there's a new soul rune crisis now as well.
Yeah, which we tried to fix recently with making more soul runes from the soul altar.
Yes.
I remember teasing Deg for years afterwards that I was going to add fire runes to drop tables again.
Yeah.
I can't remember how many. There was some specific number of fire runes I said I was going to add to everything's drop table, like 1 million or something.
Well, myself and Mod Deg, we had a celebration from fire runes hit 100 GP.
Yeah.
Because they had gone from 5.
Mission accomplished.
They'd gone from 5 GP to 100 GP, and we were like, we did it. But players weren't annoyed. Like, I don't know if you were personal experience. I mean, from my personal experience, players weren't annoyed that we did that. I think players liked runes and rune crafting to be worthwhile. Viswax was a very useful reward. It did a whole bunch of things. It kind of fixed auras a little bit by resetting cooldowns. It was a cool mini game that spawned a bunch of FCs and like a lot of community interaction and getting the right runes per day. There was a personal rune as well, but there was what rune is it today, what rune is it this week, that sort of thing. And it touched a lot of other things, like it did divine locations, it did loads of other bunch of stuff. So we managed to make a cool update out of an economy-focused design.
It's interesting actually in the context of this topic, because in a sense runes were dead content.
Yes. Yeah.
But then
and the whole runecrafting skill itself was useless because it just made a product that wasn't worth anything.
And I think it would have been okay if it was just a handful of old items. It didn't matter. It'd be fine. But because there was an entire skill focused around those items, it felt.
And it was a very lean update. It was just myself and Mod Deg. We spent 6 weeks on it, I think. I mean, there was a lot of analysis and things, like making sure we got all the drop tables for, like, so where do fire runes come from? Oh, there's a load of them come from these specific cases. We took them off there. Our player's going to do rune crafting after this, hopefully. We ended up doing a couple more rune crafting updates in the future. Like we had the different pouches and things as well. The huge pouch and things like that afterwards, which helped a lot as well. But yeah.
So related to that, I think that's a super interesting insight to get into. Yeah, the perfect example of something that was dead content that was kind of brought back. Viswax, I know, is like a big contentious balancing topic even now. And it's not so much for main accounts, but specifically for Ironman. And I wanted to kind of segue through that and kind of discuss that a little bit and talk about sort of what amount of effort or time goes into specifically balancing around Ironman. Because I know when Ironman mode initially was released, I believe the whole point was kind of to not balance around it, and if it was going to be super hard, that was the point. And I think the mentality is probably, if you look at recent drop tables, has probably shifted. But specifically on Viswax, that is now a time gate for a lot of players, where there's only so much Viswax you can get. It's not limited by your runes, it's just there's a daily limit of 100 a day. And I've seen a ton of like proposed, let Ironman make different amounts of Viz, or let an untradeable amount of Viz cost extra runes, or whatever else. Is that something that has made it to your radar at any point?
It has. The entire topic of balancing around Ironman is genuinely we don't. We do consider, Ironmen are considered, and we have a lot of internal people who play Ironmen and they speak up for the Ironmen themselves and like say, hey, what could we do different for Ironmen? This isn't such a, I don't want to swear, it's such a huge grind for them. In terms of Viswax, it's a very difficult decision because Viswax solely relies on the very limited amount of supply that comes to the game because it's a tradable commodity. Yes, Ironmen could get access to more Viswax. That's untradeable, but what about other players? Does that make it unfair that they can get? Why don't normal players get 100 extra untradeable Viswax per day? And if regular players did, that'll completely screw the economy of Viswax. That's 100 extra supply of Viswax that doesn't need to be purchased from the Grand Exchange. That's not coming from a different player. I mean, like, there's huge repercussions for the economy of runes and Viswax as a result. So part of the reason why we haven't done that, specifically for Ironman. Normally the Ironman problem comes down to economy issues. So like I know that when I was designing archaeology, we were talking about Ironman and archaeology, and because the whole premise of archaeology is that you can, I mean, the numbers are probably different now, but the original balancing was you got 5 unfinished projects an hour from excavating. You only excavate enough materials to finish 3 every 5. So if you wanted to get the extra 2 projects finished in that hour, you had to buy materials. Now, of course, for Ironman, that they don't get to buy those materials. Like Ironman are just stuck at the 6% XP rate all the time because they're Ironman. We decided that for the overall health of the game, in terms of the economy and the skill design for archaeology, that was fine. I mean, Ironman listening to this are probably like, that's not fine, and they're screaming at me right now.
I had to do the exact same thing with mining and smithing, that it's unintuitive from an Ironman perspective that the amount of ore you gather when mining and the amount of ore you consume when smithing don't match. But if they did match, ore would be pointless.
Yeah.
Like ore would be meaningless. It might as well just be untradeable or not exist. Like if you level your mining skill and don't generate any ore, and you level your smithing skill and don't use any ore, it comes out equally, right?
Yeah, then
there has to be, smithing
nothing.
has to need more ore than mining consumes to get to 99, because maxing is such a basic part of our game's meta.
Yeah, of course.
But like,
if I max both skills, I need more ore, otherwise mining wouldn't
but it's worth mentioning that
need to exist.
material caches and archaeology stem from this conversation that we had. So material caches exist for Ironman. They didn't exist in the original design.
Oh, okay.
I mean, like maybe that's my problem as a designer, but they didn't exist in the original design. And we play tested it and we thought about it and like, what happened? Why can't I go get like Blood of Orcus? Why can't I go get that specific material? And it's like, well, no, the intention was that you have to go to these places, and the way the balancing works out probably doesn't work out in actuality. But every hotspot has a favored material, so there's a 40% chance of Orcus on this hotspot, but another hotspot that has Orcus is like 20%. So the intention was that you went out into the world and did regular archaeology and got those materials at the same time. And the materials you didn't need, you sold, or you banked, or you kept, or whatever. But also, you're also getting additional projects, which meant higher deficit of experience. And then there was like, well, what about Ironman? This sounds like a horrible Ironman experience. If I'm missing like 5 Blood of Orcus,
yeah, having to have a 1 in 5 chance of getting a Blood of Orcus.
Yeah, it sounds like a nightmare. And I'm just collecting more and more projects.
Something that came up in the playtesting was it felt bad to get more projects.
Yeah.
While I'm collecting materials for the project I've got, and I get another project, and even though you could just throw it away, right? But
yeah,
it feels
but you
bad.
wouldn't want to. No,
It feels bad
you don't
to
want
get
to
it.
destroy this
situation
artifact you spent 20 minutes.
You'd
building.
rather it was
Absolutely
another
not.
material.
So like it stemmed from that conversation about what about Ironman? How does this feel for Ironman? And that's where material caches came from.
If we added in an Ironman exception for Viswax, it would set a precedent that would prompt people to want Ironman exceptions for everything else.
Yeah.
Maybe
Yeah,
you could say,
potentially, yeah.
oh, well, Viswax is actually 10 times worse than the next bad problem, maybe. But then people would immediately start looking at the next problem and say, well, you fixed Viswax, why aren't you fixing this? And suddenly Ironman would have dozens of exceptions for all sorts of different pieces of content. And to an extent, wouldn't be Ironman anymore? I mean,
I think
philosophically,
at a
I
certain
feel
point,
like it wouldn't be Ironman anymore.
Ironman, I mean, I think that's almost a discussion in itself, is like what
Yeah.
makes Ironman mode Ironman
Yeah.
mode, because the idea when Ironman first came out was like you stand alone. It was supposed to be a solo only game mode that was very, very tough. Correct me if I'm wrong there.
No.
But it has very much shifted now to it's a casual game mode for a lot of players. You want to be able to group.
I guess it's splitting hairs a little bit. It doesn't necessarily that it was intended to be difficult, but we just sort of assumed it would be difficult.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
participating in the economy is such a big part of what RuneScape is. The
And
idea
being a
that you
solo player,
didn't
yeah.
have access to that resource sounded hard. Like
Yes.
that's demanding.
I think that makes a certain amount of sense that you can't necessarily balance for both. I would say though too, in my own personal experience, the updates that are economically good also can work out very well for Ironman. So I think you can potentially hit both depending on how it works. So these very like robust drop tables on
Yeah.
Elder Godwar's loots that were done, I believe, predominantly by Mod Sponge. I think a lot of them hit many of the items that Ironman felt they didn't want to have to go after and collect. They're an endgame PVMer. They should not be picking cave nightshades in a
Yeah,
in a cave.
sure, but also that helps regular players as well.
Yeah.
Yes, it does.
Like that's an instance where that both players can benefit. Like, and a regular player doesn't really care if they get King Nightshades. Like, well, I could have just traded for it, but like it's nice. It's a nice drop.
Yeah.
But for Ironman, it's a huge boon for them.
It's a
because-
massive time save for an Ironman.
Yeah, but like in those instances, that's fine. When both parties can benefit. Well, when normal players don't care,
Yeah,
and
if
Iron
it's not
Men
a
do
negative
care.
for a normal player,
Yeah,
but it's
absolutely.
good for Iron Man,
Yeah.
then that's something you're going to do.
Mod Shogun and Sponge, they do think about these things. I know that Mod Shogun did a lot of drop deals in Elder Goblins Dungeon as well, and he was thinking about what to drop, which is a difficult problem in itself, and a whole
Yeah, of course.
conversation as well. But also try and ensure that different types of players are involved in that sort of thing as well at the same time.
Yeah. Anytime we can, if the design makes it better for Iron Man and regular players, we would do that without hesitation.
Yeah, exactly. That's
It's only when
no-brainer.
there's a trade-off between the needs of Iron Man and the needs of regular players that there's a problem.
So there's no intentionality to like keep Iron Man mode hard necessarily. It's more just
No, it's hard enough, right?
Okay, so there's no.
We don't need to go out of our way to
no
make it hard.
objections to that. Relating to drop tables, if we could talk about Elder God Wars, and in particular, the impact the Elder God Wars engine has had on the early game. Because in the past, even if you made an account, I made an account 3 years ago, hardcore from scratch, and I made a new one 3 weeks ago. And much of the early game from a few years ago is completely skipped over by Elder God Wars. So you've got, for example, Croesus drops such a ridiculous amount of charms, and so does the Archglacior, that there's no need to even really pick up charms from anything else throughout your adventure, and you're going to have enough to finish summoning. Same thing with commons. Early game Iron Man or even main account, it's hard to come by like raw GP you can use, whether it's alkables or whatever else. And now the meta has very strongly shifted to you can do zero mechanic Archglacior, you can do Croesus even in a 50-person mass, and you will make millions of raw GP every single hour. And that allows you to really jumpstart the early game and fly through those early levels. So my question kind of pertaining to that is, was that intentional to get people onto the new content and fast tracking the early game? Or was it more just as a result of the balancing that happened with regard to those bosses, and it's sort of an unintended mechanic?
I think it's a little bit of both, but I wouldn't say it was unintended. So our philosophy the last couple of years has been something we've called internally progressive balancing.
Okay.
So progressive balancing is where we sort of like don't take into account older pieces of content as much as we used to. So you might remember when we released, like an example in six in my mind is Chaotic Claws. Like we held up the price of Dragon Claws by requiring it as a piece of equipment to make Chaotic Claws, and we have done that a ton throughout the game. That used to be our philosophy, was making sure that old content wasn't devalued in any way as best as we possibly could. I mean, in Mod Jack's example during the Mining Smithing update, he made sure that Nex armor was still viable and still useful and still had a place.
I think the value of a Nex skill went up after the Mining Smithing rework.
Exactly, yeah.
Despite massively nerfing the rune drops.
Yeah, and that was as a direct result of us trying to uphold old pieces of content. We have shifted from that mentality to making sure that old content exists as a legacy. You can go back and play it, and it still has its niches and still viabilities, but it's not there to be held up anymore by.
Okay.
It's not like that content has been and gone. It had its place. It had its time. Much like the much great VHS tapes, it had its place in its time. CDs as well. They had their time. There's no point in trying to uphold these older pieces of content any longer. And I think that's just the case with Elder Goblins Dungeon. Elder Goblins Dungeon, we tried to make sure that it was the best place to get money, and it was worthwhile modern players' time, and the specific drops that were on it were carefully selected to make sure that we did outnode some older pieces of content and older different methods. To what extent, I think, there's the other side of that coin, where it's probably a little bit too far for a low level player, because things like no mechanic Archglacior was intended to be a PVM learning mechanic and not a
charm farming or
best
money
possible
making
money
or
source.
whatever else.
best
Of course.
raw GP and best charm farming of all time. It wasn't intended to be that method, but the design intention was to outmode older pieces of content, and for the new content to be way more profitable and way more worthwhile than older pieces of content.
You mentioned that happened in the last couple years. Was there anything that brought on that sort of change? Because I know, Masterwork is a great example. It requires you to, it's sort of like the defender grind. If you want to get a tier 90 defender, you need to go back through the Warriors Guild, get the Dragon one, and then you get the tier 70, and then you get the tier 80 from next, and then you can go to Calfight King after that. And
I think it's just kind of a holistic judgment that gradually over time that building requirements on top of other requirements just gets creakier and creakier and stranger, and we're still maintaining old content, because that old content is, the amount of content in the game increases, and if all of that content is still farmed and viable, then suddenly we have to worry about the balancing of not 5 bosses, but 50 bosses.
I think it's just the sheer practicality of upholding 21 years worth of content.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Just makes it incredibly difficult to design anything in the game.
Yeah.
Like, how do you design something that is both wanted by modern players, but also is upholding older pieces of content? So hey, we're going to release a new level 90 pickaxe, but it now requires the pickaxe of Song and Earth, and like a dragon pickaxe and a gilded dragon pickaxe, and also you have to go do like 1,000 hours of lava flow mine. Like
it gets a little ridiculous.
It just becomes ridiculous at that point. So you have to say like, well, no, we want players to play new content. We want players to play good content. So make sure that the new content does outmode and outsurpass those pieces of content. So make sure that players are playing the best piece of content that we're releasing, because Edo Gobble's Dungeon, I think, is some of the best content we've released for a long, long time. And
we don't mind that people are going to 3 rather than 2. Like, that's good.
Exactly.
Okay.
Because we're proud of what we've done, right? It's worth saying it does depend on the content, though, like this philosophy.
Yes.
Like with mining and smithing, there was a big controversial update. Like, it made a lot of changes that were controversial, right? Salvage was controversial, changing the values of all the runes was controversial, stone spirits were controversial. Like, there was a lot there, especially related to the topic of drop tables. There was a potential for that. Like, we were very worried on launch that update was going to be a disaster. And so we made sort of, what's the right word? Like, we made very cautious decisions of like, well, since we're worried about this update, let's make sure that we're paying careful attention to next. Let's make sure that we're paying careful attention to all these other older pieces of content. Like you gave the example of the pickaxe, right? It still requires you to go do all these old things, because we didn't want mining and smithing to be the Runespan, effectively, of like, everyone just sits in the Artisans Guild and no one ever leaves, and there's like 20 years of mining and smithing content. We didn't want to just make it all redundant overnight. It would have been a hell of a lot less work if we just ignored it all and just like turned it all off or balanced it so it was irrelevant. But we wanted it to still feel like mining and smithing. Whereas with Elder God Wars, we were a lot more confident in the update. Like, this is great. This is amazing content. It's really, really good. We don't mind that it makes some older content redundant, because actually we've got all this amazing new content.
Yeah, you suppose you'd rather people play the new stuff
Exactly.
that is good and is up to date, as opposed to
and like there
doing
are some
something 20
areas
years
where
old.
we do this. It's like the Zuck capes require the kiln capes, right?
Yes, they do.
So like there are some places where we still do this, where it makes sense for the progression. That we did have a conversation where Zuck capes were tradable. We had a conversation where Zuck capes didn't require kiln capes as well. That you defeated Zuck and you got the cape. But we came to the conclusion that no, we like the idea that this older content, you go through the elder grind, or the elder kiln, and the elder all the pieces of content. You go through Jad, you go through Harakin, and you go through Zuck. Like, it felt a nice piece of progression for that slot, for that cape, and we will uphold those certain things where we think is worthwhile and add to the content rather than take away from it.
In my like personal opinion, that's a really good example of it done pretty much perfectly, because it thematically makes sense, and it also makes a lot of sense when you're looking at lapsed players or players that have had to do this past grind, and they don't want something they've done in the past to be completely obsolete.
Prestigious, right? That's the thing. Yeah, like it's prestigious content. That it's not just like, oh, I happened to get a dragon pickaxe drop, luckily, from the battlefield, the Chaos battlefield. It's a piece of prestigious content. Like, I've killed Jad, I've killed Harakin, and now I've killed Zuck. Like, it's a progression of.
And fight kill hits differently, like to say Barrows, or God Wars 1. Like, it's prestigious in a way that those other content kind of just aren't.
I would totally agree with that. I think personally, there's a line. I think I'm more on team Elder God Wars was good, but for whatever reason, it still sits strangely with me that a lot of the early game is kind of made obsolete. And I know a lot of players feel the same way about maybe like a mini game like Trouble Brewing that is kind of died off. And I wonder if it's mostly a nostalgia thing, because I've made a ton of accounts and I've played through these things in the past, and it's kind of strange to see, oh, no one will ever go do that thing that I spent a lot of time doing, or I have memories doing. And I wonder if it's a lot of that, because I think, logically speaking, for a new player, that's way better. Get them playing the brand new stuff that just came out that is up to date. But I think, sometimes it can. I think it can rub some people the wrong way.
I mean, you alluded to with your Croesus Hunter example earlier that, like, I think there probably is a line where, like, as you said, we want people to do the new content. We don't mind if the people who were doing God Wars 2 are now doing God Wars 3. That's good. If people are only doing God Wars 3 for the entire game, that's
a little too far.
That actually is, that's not intended, and that's not what we would want. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a big enough problem to nerf it. So like, there's a delicate balance for us of like it's too good, and ideally, like, we wouldn't necessarily have chosen to do it that way in the first place, but perhaps changing it now does more harm than good.
Yeah.
So that doesn't necessarily, just because we say, oh, maybe we wouldn't have done that in an ideal world, doesn't mean we necessarily think it's a good idea to change it now.
I think a good follow-up to that, you're alluding to an amount of time that is acceptable to make a change to something or a nerf to something. There have been some recent examples where things get nerfed well after release and it's not nearly as well received. And the first question is like, why wasn't that done right away? Because I've now invested in this item or this whatever. I think a good example of that was probably Greater Ricochet, if there was any kind of involvement in that, where it was nerfed many, many months after release. And I think the nerf objectively was very well done. I think it was a perfect nerf that actually was a buff to a number of players as well. And I thought the balancing on it was fantastic and made it a better, more unique ability, but it was still not well received. And to you guys, is that just an example of like, this was just done a little bit later than it should have?
I think there are a lot of factors in play when it comes to when something should be nerfed. We do a lot of, in the past, I'm guilty of it, we've done a lot of knee-jerk reaction nerfs to pieces of content and knee-jerk reaction buffs to content as well, which we've come later to regret. And it's to the point where, oh, we've already changed it, we can't change it again, or it's been too long for us to change it, so we won't change it at all. And then there are other factors of, like with the Ricochet changes, it was more finding the right solution, and that's a different factor. We're finding the right solution. So we know we needed to change it, but we had a lot of internal discussion with the Combat Council, with the developers that made it, with players who just play the game and aren't involved in those things. They're like, what does this change? So I'm like, what does this change? Like, I'm making sure we get the numbers right and the feeling of the change right. Was, for the Greater Ricochet example, that's the reason why it took so long for that to get changed. Should it have been changed sooner? Sure. I mean, I think in an ideal world,
In a perfect world, yeah.
in an ideal world, it wouldn't have gone out like that. It would have gone out as the way it is right now, but we don't live in a perfect world, and it wouldn't have taken as long. But with those sort of things, it does take a lot. And then there are other pieces of content that have just been in the game for so long. It's like, I can't think of any specific examples, but
Drygores is the obvious one that comes to mind for me.
oh god, yeah.
I spent some time trying to figure out what to do with the too high availability of Drygores.
Oh yeah.
But I couldn't
Very
get
common.
any consensus on an agreement. And by the time there was any will to do anything about it, there were just so many of them in the economy
Exactly,
that even
yeah.
if we'd nerfed the drop table, it wouldn't have made
So
any
there
difference.
was a push like to nerf the drop table at the time because they were coming in too quickly.
We realized fairly quickly that there was a problem, but there wasn't a consensus on whether or not it should be. I mean, you kind of alluded to it, right? Like it might be like, let's say there's like a 2-week window, right? Like
Yeah, of course. Yeah,
be
just
kind of
arbitrary.
arbitrary.
Yeah.
There's kind of a 2-week window where it's like, well, this only just launched. You might expect some fluctuation. Maybe there might be a buff or a nerf within that window. After 2 weeks, it's starting to feel permanent. And then at that point, we're kind of like, if we change it now, this starts to disrupt, like it's disruptive. It's starting to, people have become accustomed to it working in this way. It's become an established part of the game. If we buff or nerf it now, that's actually a change rather than a fix. And then, so then that time we say, oh, okay, well, maybe we don't need to do that then. Because at that point, there's a cost to the players, right? We don't want to change things at that point. So then, another week goes past, another month goes past, another month goes past. No, actually, this is really a problem. Like we thought maybe we could not change it, but we do really need to change it. So, but now the change better be really good.
It has to be perfect.
Because we can't change it and then change it again.
Yeah,
That
I
would
guess
be a disaster.
the worst thing than changing Greco way too late would have been having to change it 5 months out and then again 10 months out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's an example of, and I talk about our failures, but there's an example of this with Darklight.
Yeah.
Darklight has been changed 5 times since release, I think now. And I know that Mod Rowley hates me talking about it because he was the developer for the update. But we spent many months working on Darklight. I think Darklight is in an okay place now. It certainly wasn't for a very long time. It was either too good or it was too bad. It was too good or it was too bad. Where it is now is in a decent place. But yeah,
That's not ideal. You don't
And
want to
if we applied that
Exactly.
process to a drop, to a rare
yeah,
drop,
if we applied that process to
would
something that was
wreck the economy.
valuable to the economy, that would be horrible. It'd be like, oh, Drygores are worth nothing now. Drygores are worth
Well, that's where the Panic Cell
Drygores are worth
Ones
nothing.
meme comes from, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, Panic
every
Cell
time we
Ones.
talk about anything with balancing, that's the other. I mean, the players want us to be more open about stuff, and we basically would prefer to just talk openly about everything. But if we talk about, like, I'm sure some of the stuff we've said now is going to have some people like buying or selling something, because
Drygores.
everything we say gets
Drygores,
yeah.
Of course.
That's the time to buy Drygores.
Interesting thing about Drygores was the death of CoinShare. The I don't know if you remember the release of KK.
I was not an EOC user at that point.
okay.
Yeah, I was not.
But like Drygores was supposed to be a very valuable drop. It was supposed to be very rare. Players weren't supposed to kill KK as often as they ended up doing. And this is forever indelible in my brain because it's seared in because I made such a huge mistake. I was a fairly junior balancer at the time. But Drygores are worth 500 million GP. And of course, the way CoinShare works.
Oh, with the GE system.
Yeah.
So
and of course, where CoinShare drops, it drops the market value of the or CoinShare is the market value of the item. And of course, we all know the GE doesn't update very often.
Yes.
So as more and more Drygores would come into the game, the way the CoinShare system worked was that it used to put in, maybe people don't even know how this works. The CoinShare system used to inject the item onto the Grand Exchange with no player seller. So the money goes out to the players. The item is on the Grand Exchange and is listed for market price.
Yes.
And of course, if an item is oversupplied and dropping in value,
It will never actually sell, but the money's already
the money's
generated.
in the economy.
Yeah.
The item is selling for mid price, which no one's buying for because they're paying like 10% of the market value. So it falls to me at the balance at the time to having to forcefully update the Grand Exchange prices to try and be as accurate as they can. But I don't like doing that because it causes panic with merchants and manips and things like that. So for a very long time, there was a Drygore wall, I used to call it internally, of just hundreds of Drygores never being sold. The money already in the economy, and it was like, this is unsustainable. We cannot, because the money isn't being injected. The money's not trading hands. The money's not going from player to player.
Being generated.
It's just being generated by the game. And I think the current shard share system isn't perfect because shards don't trade as often as they should. But it's definitely a hell of a lot better than what we had in the old system.
Do you think there are still Drygores on the GE at 500 mil, or did they just go like at some point?
I either purged them all.
Okay.
So that money just got generated and no Drygores actually came into the game.
Good for the economy.
Or they did eventually get sold when the price was adjusted to the correct price.
Okay. Wow. That's not something I was aware of, but I'm sure many people weren't aware of.
My biggest failure.
I mean, yeah, it makes perfect sense how it could happen. It's just tied to G values. And I know you've even as recently as this month been updating G values. Is that correct?
Yeah,
With a number of
I try
items,
to.
Because a lot of the other Godwars ones. And without getting too far into the Grand Exchange system and what's going on there, is it a situation where the Grand Exchange system itself potentially needs an overhaul to better adapt to changing prices?
Yeah, so the Grand Exchange updates itself every 8 to 24 hours. It's a completely random number. Very select people know when the Grand Exchange changes. But between 8 and 24 hours, it changes. But it requires a certain number of trades for the item's price to be changed. So one of the reasons why you see very low volume items like rares and things like that, tradable rares, don't really move in price if they're not already max cash.
Yes.
Because there's not enough of them being traded. And if there's not enough traded, the system doesn't update. So when it goes to update, it goes, have I sold X number of items? No, okay, well, we're still the same
then
price.
It just stays, yeah.
Even if it is being traded in reasonable values for its items, so untradeable tradable rares only trade like once a week or a couple of times a week. That's not enough for a regular item to update. So I think it does need updating. Like that's not a controversial take. It's getting updated, which is the problem. It would be nice if it was a system that updated based on category. So if it was a tradable rare, it updated with every sale potentially.
Yeah.
If it was more like a high-level item like the Stuffed Armadillo, then maybe that would trade like every X number of times. Maybe if it was like a percentage of trades,
yeah.
it would be nice if it did update more frequently.
If it's a little more fluid than what seems to be designed for like runes and food that is traded all the time.
Yeah.
That definitely works well for those items.
It's tricky, because to handle those low volume items, just the back end systems and the front end interfaces would just need to work completely differently to the way that they do. What you want is to see all of the trades, right?
Yeah, of course.
Or what is this actually trading for?
What was
That's
the last?
information you
What were
want.
the last 10 bought and sold at?
Yeah, but that would require the whole GE system to be redone, which I would love to see happen, but it's a huge project.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think one other. I mean, not to get too far into the Grand Exchange stuff. Some of the items that were recently updated in terms of prices were the Fractured Sapphire Armadillo pieces, I believe, because they were set at like 300K. Kind of a two-parter. First part, how much thought is put into the default base prices of some of these items? Because sometimes on launch, like a Langsword, for example, I believe came in at at 500 million coins, which seemed fairly, could end up there. But then you've got the Fasoa pieces, which this is the strongest weapon in the game, and a third of it is worth 200K. Is it just like an arbitrary number because the GE should adjust it at some point, or is it like an actually considered thing?
Most of the time it's a considered thing. Sometimes a value is placed on it because a value needs to be placed on it when we're testing, and that value doesn't get changed.
Okay.
I think that's likely what happened with the Fractured Stuff Armadillo pieces. There was a default value placed on it, which is 300K, and that wasn't updated as a result. It wasn't updated before launch. But like you said with the Length Sword, we try to consider what this item would be worth on release. Not necessarily where it's going to end up, because obviously we don't know where it's. But like normally brand new items are inflated on release.
Yes.
So we try and make sure we get the right item. So the way we in those meetings we say like, okay, so what is it? It's a 1095 sword. Do we have any comparisons to that? And like the answer is no, because there are no 1095 items. So what is our comparison? Well, it's 1092s, 1090s. So like, how much are they worth? How much do we think how much is the value from 1092 to 1095 worth? What is the rarity of these items? Like, are they rare or less rare than these current items? How difficult is the boss? All these things should play into the factor of the initial cost of the item. Like the KK example I gave earlier, we priced Dragons at 500 million because we thought, well, that's how much they should be worth the difficulty of the boss, rarity of the drops, which ended up being right, how useful they are over other items and that sort of thing. So that's what should go into the pricing of an item. Sometimes we get it wrong.
It just doesn't sometimes,
But sometimes it's one of those things that just falls through the cracks in terms of development.
There's kind of a sentiment in the player base sometimes with items where they're tentative to purchase things, because if it's really, really strong and really good and they want it, they're worried it's going to get nerfed 8 months after release. And I personally would argue that's pretty valid. I think that's happened a number of times. You've got Greater Ricochet, you've got, and I think a recent example, you've got the Fractured Staff of Armadillo is extremely strong. It is game-breakingly strong. It has not been rebalanced yet, but I think there are a number of players that definitely hold that kind of sentiment or fear that they're going to put all this money into something or spend a lot of time work for something, and then the parameters of it are going to be changed. And I guess the question there is, how do you go about in the future, changing the sentiment in the player base, and how do you go about getting the right nerfs and the right balances, either within a short period of time, or better yet, how do you release items, especially with relation to PVM, that are going to stay the way that they're initially released and sort of build back the trust of the player base?
It's a very difficult question to answer, because I don't want to come out and say we will never nerf an item ever again after it's been released, because that's not feasible.
Of course.
That's not. So I think there will forever be this concern, and I think it's a valid concern to some degree. That will be that. I think what we can do is to try and make sure that we think about exactly what the impact of items, any items, PVM or whatever items in the future, has on the economy, on the meta, on players' behaviors and those sorts of things, to try and make sure that we don't have to nerf it in the future. I think one of the concerns that a lot of players have, and maybe we have internally, is that we release things. If this concern is hanging over players' heads, we just release things that are too weak. And because if things are too weak, then only the price is going to go up. And that's not necessarily a bad thing for players. But I think releasing weak items is just...
Yeah, that's less exciting as well.
Yeah, it's less exciting, but also less damaging to your bank account, right?
Yes.
I mean, it's worth saying it still creates a massive economic uncertainty, because if we release something's weak, people can speculate.
People are going to spam by them, and then...
Exactly.
I mean, there were
They'll
examples
speculate
with
it's going to be
Solak,
buffed.
the Grimoire was what the Ritual Shard was, and then people just spam bought them because there's no way they keep it like this, and then now it's a high-value item.
Yeah. But like that, I'd argue that is almost worse, because then there's never going to be a cool new drop, because it's always going to be weaker. It's going to be very marginally better than something that you've released before. And it's like, well, why do I even bother going for it? And at that point, the content is kind of in danger of being useful and danger of being played, because it's like, well, if you literally need someone on Reddit to give you a spreadsheet of, well, this is going to give you 0.1% DPS increase. Well, how much is a 0.1 DPS increase worth?
Most people, nothing.
Probably worth not a lot. And it's very, very specific top-end players who are going to be like, well, I want this 0.1% DPS increase for like phase 4 of Solak. It's a very specific niche situation. So like we need to release items that are better than the previous items, or have a niche, I should say, and then the previous items. But I don't think that concern is ever going to go away. I think we've tried to really have a lot of impact in thought items and not nerf them down the line. It's never going to be perfect. I think that's
of course.
That's just the truth of it. And that fear is always going to be there. But it's something that we are actively trying to fix and make sure that in the future, hopefully there is a future in like, 1, 2, 3 years down the time, where it's like players can go out confident and get this new drop and use it and be like, okay, this is balanced, it's strong, it's balanced,
perfect, it's exactly where it should be.
It fills a niche, and I don't have to worry about its price ever devaluing.
Yeah, so I guess plan A is just knock it out of the park on the first go, and I guess plan B, I think the best option for an item, let's say Grico, that was performing in a way that wasn't maybe good for the game. When you are performing that nerf, like you said, it's take the time that is needed to actually implement that nerf in a good way that isn't that significant. And I think even though people were very upset about the Grico nerf, when you looked at the actual numbers of it, it was done in such a way that it still has the same level of power compared to other ranged abilities. It is still the strongest basic ability for that combat style in the game. Yeah. It's not like it was nerfed dramatically to the ground. And I think that's something that can help too, is just having that faith that if this does get nerfed, it's going to get nerfed in a way that it is still good and it is still fun and it is still useful, just possibly in a way that breaks the game a little bit less.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Cool.
100%.
Okay, well, I think that's all the time we have. Thank you all so much, everyone, for tuning in. Once again, Mod Timbo, Mod Jack, thank you so much for joining me, and we'll see you in the next one.